and Jason, I assume Ellie's not coming, so start the recording and we'll kick off.
Started.
Oh, okay, good. So great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this last webinar of the semester here at Columbia. This series has, over the past 3 years, covered a wide range of topics, and I would point out that videos of those previous sessions are all on the website for that is included in the announcement. And by the way, I would also add that if you got the notice of this event from the mail list and want to be added to our database for future notifications of other events, you could just shoot us a note. I'm just going to put the address into the chat here. Anybody who wants to be on in our database can just shoot an email to that address, and our executive director, Jason, will grab you up. So, okay, let me get started then. I'm Bill Drake from Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. This is a webinar on understanding internet governance, implications for digital data and AI governance. Today, we're talking about sort of liminal moments in the evolution of global digital governance. And when I say liminal moments, if that term's not familiar, what I mean is kind of fluid and uncertain transition periods where we're in sort of an in-between state on the threshold of something new, which often leads to a lot of uncertainty and debate and groping around, trying to sort things out among the different parties to international policy discussions, et cetera. These kinds of liminal moments often are marked by a high degree of contestation among players about how problems are understood, defined, and tackled, in which venues and by whom, based on what models, et cetera. And there's a lot of strategic efforts to shape the discourses through which the issues are understood and the agendas for proceeding with international cooperation. We had such a liminal moment 20 years ago in the context of the World Summit on the Information Society process. The WSIS, of course, was the UN negotiation that went on from 2002 to 2005. It was the first broad-based UN effort to address global information society issues, and in particular, internet governance, which ended up having a wide variety of configurative impacts on the evolution of global digital governance, both formally and informally, and was, shaped by a lot of efforts to establish public frameworks for the internet, frameworks of authority and rules, and so on, debates about exactly what was needed and who should do it, and so on. And if you could put yourself back into the mindset of the time, speaking of my liminal moments kind of thing, you remember that 20 years ago, there was a lot of misunderstandings about what internet governance was. We had three kinds of popular kinds of approaches. One was governance denial. You had people who said internet governance does not exist and cannot exist because cyberspace is anarchic and free of earthly constraints. Or the technical community people who would say, well, it's just coordination and not governance, although coordination is a form of governance. We had another kind of misunderstanding, which I would call ICANN fetishism, which associated internet governance with just whatever ICANN does with regard to names and numbers and the underlying resources of the internet. And we had intergovernmental fetishism, the people who were arguing that governance had to involve governments and intergovernmental organizations, and that authority over internet governance ought to be transferred to some UN agency, preferably the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU. And these misconceptions fed a lot of geopolitical polarization throughout the WSIS process, as people disagreed about what the hell are we talking about, who should be in charge, so on. And it threatened the whole process and could have led to a breakdown. And at the 2003 summit in Geneva, the governments adopted a declaration of principles and a plan of action. And the plan included, among other things, a call to the UN Secretary General to establish a working group on internet governance that would try to analyze these issues and develop a definition of internet governance that everybody could agree on, as well as common understandings about who does what and so on, write a report. And so in 2004, Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, appointed 40 people to a group that included today's panelists and myself, which operated on a fully peer-to-peer equal footing basis, multi-stakeholder, and which was a new thing in the UN and was a real challenge for everybody. It was a very open process. And given the confusion and deadlock among governments about internet governance, the stakeholders involved really had the ability to have an important impact on trying to identify new ways forward, a sort of third way path, including by putting forward a definition of internet governance that everybody could get their head around and that could, in ways, kind of depoliticize some of this stuff. So the WGIG put out a report and a number of other outputs, which were mentioned in the announcement for today, including a couple of books. And as we got into this, it became clear that everybody was putting forward a lot of different understandings of internet governance and definitions, some of which were problematic. And we had to try to figure out how to do a definition and understanding that was not overly normative, that was more neutral and generalizable, and could cover a wide variety of different types of governance processes. And so ultimately what we did was to adopt in the WGIG a definition that was drawing on the international relations political science definition of international regimes as a key form of governance. And actually, I'm just going to put the text of this so I don't have to, I didn't want to put a slide up, but I'll put it into the chat for anybody who's not seen this definition, then we can refer to it. But we defined as a internet governance as the development and application by governments, the private sector, civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. A lot of words. But the point is that there were three parts to this. We addressed who does internet governance, how do they do it, and what does it cover? So the who was governments, the private sector, and civil society, leaving aside the nonsense around respective roles, which was something that some governments insisted on because they insist that only governments have authority over policymaking, which obviously doesn't map with internet governance reality. How, the development and application, not just talking about stuff, as some organizations do, of shared rules, norms, etc. So a series of nested prescriptions and proscriptions about how things should be done, and what the evolution and use of the internet. So a broad definition pertaining to both the internet's physical and logical infrastructure and its use for information, communication, and commerce. So this holistic orientation then also became the basis for another WGIG proposal, which was to create an internet governance forum as a continuing institutional framework for dialogue covering the broad range of issues pertaining to governance of the internet, the underlying infrastructure, and on the internet, the use of it for information, communication, and commerce. This is not what some actors wanted. The International Telecommunication Union's Secretary General came to meetings and insisted that we should adopt a narrow definition that basically said internet governance pertained to just the underlying infrastructure and the ITU should be in control. This is obviously not what the WGIG did. And in the end, the WGIG's approach was adopted by the governments of the World Summit. And it has been, it was incorporated into the Tunis agenda on the Information Society, which concluded the process in 2005. And the definition has been routinely invoked ever since then in all UN processes and served as a basis for subsequent activities. And it's impacted how internet governance has been done in a lot of environments. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, and especially in governance, don't necessarily seem to have totally internalized and accepted the nature of the definition. Some people wave their hands and say it's too vague or broad, or we prefer a narrow definition of internet governance, etc. There's a lot that it just never seemed to have been fully taken on board by everybody, despite the fact that it's ritualistically invoked. And this becomes important today, not only because the governments are undertaking a 20-year review of the World Summit and the Information Society and its implementation, and some governments may seek to relitigate internet governance and demand greater intergovernmental authority under the banner of enhanced cooperation, but also because we are again going through a liminal period driven by technological and market change, where a lot of new issues are coming to the fore, and we are again dealing with efforts to try to put forward new global governance frameworks pertaining to, in particular, issues of data and artificial intelligence. This has been driven in particular by the United Nations Global Digital Compact process that was undertaken last year, where we had a big push by the UN Secretary General to create a new organization, intergovernmentally led, that would have this purportedly broader orientation towards digital rather than internet governance cooperation. The data governance stuff in particular has been the source of a lot of, I think, confusion. It's very similar to what we had 20 years ago with internet governance. So there's a wide variety of different ways of understanding data governance out there, a huge and diverse literature and set of practices approaching data governance from a variety of different angles with regard to who, how, and what. You have the business management-oriented literature and practices. You've got intergovernmental discussions. In the UN, a lot of this discussion's been in the World Data Forum, which is driven by statisticians and their orientation. You've got organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which have put forward their own definition of data governance, which I think is highly problematic and vague. And you have now an effort, because of the Global Digital Compact, to have a new working group on global data governance operating under the UN Commission on Science, Technology, and Development, which is supposed to develop a global kind of approach. And then on the AI side, same thing. We have these new negotiations going on, and a international panel that's been created because of the GDC negotiations, which again is trying to sort out what is the nature of the phenomena and what would governance entail and so on. And there's a lot of hand waving, a lot of different ideas out there. So it's worth thinking about. Not only has the approach to internet governance that we mapped out 20 years ago stood the test of time and is it still valid today, but also does that approach scale to, and can it be used to address the new issues that people are trying to confront with regard to data, AI, and other digital cooperation issues. So we're going to talk about this more at the IGF meeting in Norway this summer, in a panel on the working group in Internet Governance's 20th anniversary. But today we're doing a little prequel with 4 members of the WGIG here with us as panelists. Avri Doria is an independent researcher and consultant who served on the board of directors of ICANN and has also been the chair of the GNSO Council in ICANN. She was a member of the WGIG, as well as of the UN Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation and of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group of the IGF. And she's also long been very involved in the IETF and technical bodies around internet governance, and she's joining us from the US. Wolfgang Kleinvector is a professor emeritus of international communications policy at the University of Aarhus. He was a member of the ICANN board as well and served as special ambassador for the Net Mondial initiative and is the founder and chair of the European Summer School of Internet Governance and was a member of the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace and also a member of the WGIG. And he joins us today from Brazil. Marcus Kummer is the senior advisor to the Geneva Internet Platform and the Diplo Foundation. He too served on the ICANN board of directors. We have an all ICANN board alumni panel here. He also served as vice president of the Internet Society and was a Swiss diplomat. And from 2004 to 2011, he worked at the UN, where he was the executive coordinator of the working group on enhanced internet governance, and subsequently the executive coordinator of the secretariat of the IGF. He joins us from Switzerland. And finally, Vittorio Bitola, who's the head of policy and innovation at Open Exchange, a provider of open source email and DNS solutions. Vittorio, for 25 years, has been involved in many different internet startups and internet governance processes, including, again, the ICANN board of directors and the WGIG. And he joins us from Japan, where he gets the award for dedication, joining us at midnight his time. So thank you, Vittorio. So the mechanics, as always, as we always do here, 3 rounds of tour de table with the panel to set the table and put some issues on the table. And then we have a half hour for open discussion among all participants. And I hope people will choose to join in that conversation, which I think is really the distinctive thing about this webinar series, is that we get a lot of people talking together. So that's what we're doing. So, okay, so let's start then. I mentioned in the announcement 3 overarching questions that I thought we could talk about. The first pertains to the WGIG's working definition and the understanding of internet governance that was behind it. So question here, I guess, has been, what has been the impact of this, the WGIG's understanding of internet governance and the definition that we adopted? Has it stood the test of time? What are its strengths and weaknesses? And really, you know, I mean, think about it. This was done back in 2000 2005, we were groping around trying to figure out what is internet governance. With the benefit of hindsight, would we approach things in the same way today? I have my own views about that, but I think it'd be interesting to have a discussion around that. So let's start with Wolfgang. Why don't you lead us off? You've always got a lot to say around these issues.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so thank you, Bill, for the introduction and all the history, because you will not understand today's discussion if you have no clue what happened 20 years ago or even 30 years ago when the whole debate started, because the World Summit only summarized a debate which started in the middle of the 90s. And at this time, you know, there was no terminology in place. So because some people said, okay, the internet was a new thing. Should it be managed? This was too technical. Should it be regulated? This was too governmental. And so the term the internet governance emerged from a broad discussion. There was never an IFC in the IETF or something like that, which defined internet governance. And this created a confusion because, as you pointed out, in the first phase, nobody knew what internet governance is. Everybody spoke about it, and that's why we ended up with the definition. In my eyes, this was, we had the choice between the narrow definition and the broad definition in the wiki, and we decided to be in favor of the broad definition for good reasons, because we argue the internet is just the beginning. There will be much more applications. This will go to many other spheres and will produce new applications. So that means it's not just the technical management and names and numbers. So, and the three elements you pointed out are really important, because what you said, in the first sentence, we defined the stakeholders: governments, private sector, and civil society. And in the background paper, we have added the technical and academic community as a stakeholder group sui generis. In the second part, we say, okay, this has to be based on shared principles, norms, and decision-making procedures. And in the third part, we speak about the evolution and the use of the internet. So all these three elements. So the first element is the multi-stakeholder approach. The second element is the collaborative approach. And the third element is the holistic approach, because we have to take into account the evolution of the internet. This is the technical infrastructure, and the use of the internet. This is related to the internet-related public policy issues. And these three elements, multi-stakeholder, collaborative, and holistic, is relevant for all the issues which emerged in the last 20 years. So that means all the confusion which has emerged in the last 20 years by cyber governance, digital governance, data governance, ICT governance, content governance, and now we speak about AI governance, or we have a new working group on data governance in the UNCSTD. Everybody is using the term governance as an application of the internet before the word governance, and then they have no idea what it is specific. There is no definition for AI governance. There is no definition for data governance. There's no definition for cyber governance. But if you take the three elements of the internet governance definition, then you can say all these three elements are very relevant for all these various forms of governance in the digital age. And insofar, my conclusion is it's better today not to use the terminology we had developed in the 90s, 30 years ago, internet governance. Today, we are speaking about governance in the digital age. And this is relevant both for the original internet and then for all applications which emerged in the last 20 years. Thank you.
Okay. That was a very concise summary. Thanks, Wolfgang. Marcus, how about you? Your thoughts? We don't hear you. At least I don't.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Well, you said it all, and Wolfgang as well. I mean, it's I would maybe look back a little bit more at the history, and the elephant in the room at the time was the role of the US and ICANN. And so when we started it, it was clear, and I approached this as a diplomat, and I was given the task of putting together the WGIG and to get it started. And I realized if we focus on ICANN and the role of US, we would be at loggerheads right from the beginning, because we were at loggerheads at the WSIS itself and couldn't agree on what it was. So from a diplomatic point of view in negotiations, it is always conducive to success to find a small bit of common understanding, of common agreement, find the so-called low-hanging fruit. And by inviting WGIG members right from the beginning, say, what are the issues related to internet governance? What is important? And there it was clear that we could all agree, yes, it's important that we protect the children. It's important that we fight cybercrime and all that. These were right to begin, were important steps where we could find common ground. And so we found more and more common ground as a working group on internet governance, where we found a common understanding. And that in itself was a remarkable achievement. And you pointed out that it was in a UN context, an unheard of experiment as a sort of multi-stakeholder cooperation where everybody participated as equals. And there, obviously, we then in the end came up with what was named as a broad definition of internet governance. And the definition itself is a relatively high level of abstraction. And I went around the world explaining what it was. Obviously, I had the slide up, but then I also had an explanatory slide. And there, what the WGIG report found its way into the Tunis agenda, and is not just the definition as such, they're explanatory paragraphs in the chapter on internet governance, which clearly state it's more than naming and addressing internet governance. It's related to the use and abuse of the internet. So you put it together in 4 bullet points. It's about the physical infrastructure, the cables and things. It's about the logical infrastructure, the names and the addresses and the standards, but it's also related to the use and abuse of the internet. And there, back to what Wolfgang said, we have an agreed definition on internet governance, but we don't have and there was considerable work that went into it, but we don't have agreed definitions on digital cooperation or AI governance or data governance. But these are all issues happening on top of the internet. Without the internet, we wouldn't talk about digital governance. We don't have standalone computers. What makes them relevant is that they're connected to each other. The internet allows them to talk to each other. And that's where the governance element comes in. Now, question, has it stood up the test of time? I checked my own little AI application, and it said only up to the point, yes, it was a remarkable achievement, but it was too vague, and it is not normative. We never said it would be normative because we knew it. We were not asked to produce a normative definition, but it's a descriptive definition. And there, I think it has stood the test of time. And I think it covers all. We had this discussion at the MAG meeting, I think a year or 2 ago. Is there a difference between digital governance or internet governance as such? And somebody said, well, yeah, maybe the land registries, but yes, okay. Are they digital governance and not internet governance? But they're not on standalone computers. It makes them relevant because you can actually access them. And so again, I think the definition as we had it remains relevant, but yes, we have to recognize the internet is not the same as it was in 2003, 2004. We all know that. All the social media didn't exist. We didn't have voice over IP even. It just began then. All the video streaming and it's a completely different environment. But again, the definition as such, what it addresses remains there. And in my opinion, it is still valid. But of course, it was maybe naive to assume that everybody would, okay, now we go multi-stakeholder. We have to tell the WTO now, okay, make all digital trade multi-stakeholder. They obviously have their own mechanism, and that was clear right from the beginning, it would not happen. And also when you look now at big tech, do they ask civil society to comment or not? Presumably not. I mean, and again, there was maybe, it was sort of the end of a era in a way. When we came up was the end of the glorious 90s, the belief in globalization and all that, but that soon began to fade with the financial crisis. That became obvious that maybe industry self-regulation is not the nec plus ultra. Governments began to muscle their way back in, and pandemic again was a big return of governments, and now here we are. And I think governments want to have their own say, and regulation, more regulation is inevitable. Okay, I've already talked too much. Thanks.
Yeah, more regulation is inevitable seems to be a coherent message there. All right, thanks, Marcus. Audrey, your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going back to the question you asked, which is the way I wrote it down. Would it be the same? And my first answer is no. And then, of course, but probably. And let me look at that. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about the working definition is there's so much you can do with it in terms of the exegesis, the interpretation of the words. And you know, in terms of lectures and discussions that I've had, it's always, what do those words look like from various disciplines? Because those words all have roles in other disciplines. Their application to internet governance, as it was a new application. So that has been very interesting. And you know, in preparing for this, it was kind of fun to go back and reread the report and then do a quick glance through the background report, which I always like to tell people, there's really a lot of good stuff there that's worth reading. But anyhow, that at in one way of looking at it, the definition still works. You know, you've got your part one. One of the problems we had at the time is we were a lot more innocent back then. And as we were still in the period where the internet was an unmitigated good. And, you know, there were a couple of voices screaming about possible problems in the future, but by and large, it was always and everywhere a good thing in most of our minds. That's obviously not the case in anybody's mind this day. That awareness that the internet is something that can be used as much for ill as for good is a new concept that we have to bring into it. One of the things I've always found interesting about a working definition is we didn't work it. You know, we put it on the table. This is the working definition. Let's live with it forever. So the first part of it works, but I really think it needs to take into account that whole trust, that whole distrust, that whole dis side of this, the disinformation, the disrespect, the fights, the whatever, that has to go into it. And you know, I think in terms of rules and programs and all that, that's it. Okay, we're trying to convince AI. I'm one of those. I failed to write a dissertation on AI in the early 80s and have been thinking about it since then. So I'm really impressed that AI is happening finally, maybe. And such, but okay, that's another programming technique. It's a different programming technique. It's something we're learning to use. So I think the second part doesn't change that much. Although it deals as much with the use as the underlying structure. And then you get to the shape and use of the internet. Now, one argument is, as was given, well, it's the internet still at the bottom of everything. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. And I don't think it will always be the case. So if we want a definition that extends beyond our conception of the one internet that is the one and only, and all uses the same address base, and all uses the same namespace, pay no attention to those other names over there. Pay no attention to those different ways of addressing, etc. You know, then it won't work. But you only have to change it in a word. And, you know, in a sense, the internet could include all of that. It's, you know, it's an all-encompassing word. Or we can use the next new word, the digital, you know, cooperation, or whatever words we want to use. They are just words. They are baskets that we fill up. We eventually get sick of having put too much stuff in them. And then we come up with new terms. I've used my 4 minutes.
Thank you. But you used them well, so that's good. Oh, how did I get an echo? Vittorio.
Yes, well, I think the other people already said most of what I wanted to say, but I really think that to decide whether the definition is still current, we need to start from seeing whether it worked or not, and comparing the internet of today with the internet of then. And I agree with what Adrian was saying. I mean, 20 years ago, the internet was an astounding success, and people would disagree on how to govern it, but nobody disagreed on the fact that it had been a success. It had been almost entirely bringing up good things for everyone. Whether it's culturally, economically, in terms of peace and understanding and communication. Today, it's well, maybe the opposite. You know, last week there was a survey published in the UK, and they surveyed like 1,200 young people and asked, would you prefer to live in a world without the internet? And about half of them said yes. And this is terrible. It is terrible because for us, for our generation, the internet was really a great opportunity of growth and enlightenment. And for these people, I mean, they're afraid of it and they think it's negative. It's terrible. And so what went wrong? I think there were at least two big phenomena that the internet governance, whatever is we, I mean, the people that govern the internet failed to govern. And one is social media, and with all the negative consequences they had on the psyche of people, on the society, the way of behaving, the public opinion, democracies, and whatever. And the other one is concentration. I mean, there was no way to prevent this immense concentration of power into the hands of 5 companies in the single part of the world, and maybe some Chinese ones, but the entirety of the rest of the world is left out of the game. And so, did the definition had a part in these failures? No, I think the definition is vague and general enough and flexible enough that it still applies. So I think the problem was not in the definition. The problem was in the fact that it was not enacted. So the narrow part of the definition went well. I mean, the narrow governance of the infrastructure and identifiers and whatever, I think it went more or less well. There were controversies, but in the end it worked. But the broader part, I mean, the part about the impact on society completely failed. And I think that's because, I mean, we wrote that all the stakeholders have to be involved in their respective roles, but then nobody understood what their respective roles really were, and especially governments, in a way. I mean, the governments are the only ones that have a stick, not just the carrots. I mean, civil society doesn't have sticks. They cannot force the private sector to do whatever it wants to do. And so the governments just decided that, okay, this is a new thing of the internet, especially the Western governments, of course. We just have to let it go, let the market work, and it will work fine, and it didn't. So, I mean, the reason why now we see more challenges to this institutional system that we conceived 20 years ago is because, you know, there are some governments that were unhappy 20 years ago and are still unhappy now, and that's fine. But there are new governments, there are newcomers into the camp of unhappiness, especially in Europe. I see many of them. And that's because they realized they were sort of cheated. They were told that, you know, the internet will continue to bring growth and happiness and money to everyone in all parts of the world if you just leave it alone. And it didn't work this way. And so that's the problem we have to address. But I think it's not a problem of definition. It's a problem of enforcement. And maybe regulation is the answer to enforcement. Maybe we can invent something new. I don't know. But I think this is the problem we should focus on.
Right. Thanks, Vittorio. Well, of course, we're not trying to fetishize the definition so much as there's an understanding of internet governance and what it is that's behind the definition. And that's what we really, I mean, the precise words are less key. But okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the new context then. Several of you have already flagged it. I mean, there are these processes now around data governance and AI governance. Are there lessons to be learned from what we did 20 years ago that would be helpful in those contexts? Or because I have the feeling when I look at a lot of those discussions that we're going through a lot of the same kinds of hand waving and disagreement and disorientation around the fundamentals of what are we talking about and what does governance mean in this context. So is the approach that we took back then applicable to, extensible to these new sets of issues around data, around AI? Are there any particular lessons to be learned that the people who are working on that stuff now, maybe they could look back at what was done before in the UN context rather than starting afresh? And just some thoughts on that, Wolfgang, to start.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, as I said in my first intervention, the problem at this time in Geneva was that we needed innovation in policymaking. So I think this was in the speech Kofi Annan gave us in the forum in New York when he said, okay, the internet is an innovation in technology, but policymaking is still rooted in the 20th and 19th century. For the 21st century, we need innovation in policymaking. So, and I think the multi-stakeholder approach was the innovation for the time being, that we made very clear that the problems of the future cannot be managed in a one-stakeholder approach, neither through the business sector alone, nor to the governmental sector alone. It needs all stakeholders, and I include next to civil society also technical and academic community and other groups who are involved in an issue. So I think it was very clear that there will be no single model for the multi-stakeholder approach. That's why I always rejected the language, the multi-stakeholder model. It was the approach, a multi-stakeholder approach, and you have the model built around the issue. So that means for cybersecurity, you needed a different approach than for the management of names and numbers or for content moderation or for whatsoever. So that means the basic thing was, you know, it has to be multi-stakeholder, all stakeholders have to be involved. It has to be collaborative and holistic. You have to take into account, you know, all neighboring issues. So that means everything is connected with everything. Insofar, this holistic approach, which is the third part of the definition, is extreme importance if you want to move forward. So, and here I think this is the main lessons for all the discussions we will have now for data governance and AI governance. In my eyes, these are the two main fields at the moment on the international level, with the UN CSTD working group on data governance and with the various plans on AI governance. That means to benefit from the discussions we had 20 years ago and to adjust them to the new challenges. I think this makes sense. And the key point is really, and unfortunately, we are back in a situation where some groups prefer a one-stakeholder governance approach. And business, and I think Markus mentioned it, so 20 years ago, they were much open and said, yeah, we can work together with civil society. I remember also in WSIS, we had the ICC and the Internet Governance Caucus from civil society working hand in hand. If you look now into discussion in Meta, Google, or also the Chinese companies, do they really accept the civil society as a counterforce? No. So they make their deals with the government, and if government and private sector goes together, this is the tyranny in the internet world. So that means, I think this is the key message we should continue to believe. And it has worked to a certain degree, so it has produced a lot of good things. But the risk is now that we lose it all together because it goes back into the hands of either governmental leadership and or private sector leadership or joint private sector and government leadership would be the worst case for the future of not only the internet, but the whole digital sphere.
Okay, so the multi-stakeholder dimension is certainly an important part of those discussions. Marcus, data, AI, relevance.
Well, essentially what Wolfgang has said, I think the multi-stakeholder model for defining a framework for the governance of these issues still remains a valid framework. But again, the times they are changing and maybe a little bit less conducive to the multi-stakeholder, the inclusion of non-governmental actors, in particular, I think of civil society. And again, looking back, the approach Western governments had to begin with, taking a step back, was rooted in the 90s, which was essentially the decade of the triumph of the liberal market economy, of globalization, when governments took a step back and actually agreed that the technology should be let to evolve without being harmed or being slowed down by government interference. Now, that may have been defensible to begin with, but then with the growing power of some of the big tech companies, which develop, and well, various colleagues pointed out the negative impacts, which we did not see 20 years ago. And especially Vittorio said, it's interesting to say that today's youngsters say, no, we would actually be better off without the internet. And the negative impact of social media, I think, was we didn't know that, or the interference of misinformation, all these things were not there when we actually had these discussions. And I think Avri also made the point that it was seen as the framing of the internet. We just very much looked at the positive impact. Yes, we did talk about the possible abuse, but the negative sides were much less visible or in the forefront of people's mind. Okay, can we learn from all that? The fear is obviously that, and that is the big angst, that it now goes back in more and more into a traditional intergovernmental framing, the discussions where non-governmental stakeholders have less say. And we saw that in the evolution or in the process leading to the Global Digital Compact, which was multi-stakeholder by name. As the proponents said, no, we include all stakeholders, but it was essentially a very limited interaction, a very limited opportunity for non-governmental stakeholders to make their voice heard. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Avri, as a AI enthusiast.
I see. Now, it's funny. I've spent many years looking for AI. I found a lot of artificial experts, but I still have trouble understanding. Actually, no, I learned from AI what human intelligence actually means. But that's a topic for a different day for me to explain how I've learned to understand human intelligence from AI. I think that one of the things we're running into the same issue we ran into 20 years was, back then we were defining all of our terminology in terms of the existing technology, and now we try to do the same thing when we're talking about data and AI, try to use the same terminology and think that the same notions do map onto it. And indeed, they do map onto it. They are a necessary part of any new definition, but those things go beyond. Those things bring new understandings, new aspects that weren't there in the underlying. The use of the internet was very different than the use of telecommunications before it. The use of AI will be very different than the use of the internet. And to say that it may run over the internet or may not is really not the relevant. So I think that, again, we're going to follow a very similar pattern of borrowing previous meetings and then adjusting them over time to meet that. Some of the things have remained very similar. In reading, I saw a line that I see in almost every document that comes out, in the GDC documents, in all of the new wonderful stuff, is capacity building. We need to do more capacity building. And that particular one struck me. That hasn't changed at all. And part of the importance, there's a lot of capacity building now for the internet, for the lower levels, the use a little less so, but that's building. So that is still a big part of the need in this governance, and the governance does include that notion of capacity building. So that was a very important part that I thought it was really good. I think the governance includes now more advocacy than it used to. That there was a little bit of advocacy. It was those civil society people, but now the advocacy has taken on, it's a thread with its own identity. It's issues that we have followed for years. Remembering back in 20 years ago, we couldn't utter the words human rights in any of these internet governance meetings. Now we can. So though that notion can be included from the beginning, we don't need to work our way back there. Though, of course, with some of the backlash and backsliding we have now, it's hard to be sure that we don't need to once again rebuild that. I personally still don't think that we can blame the platforms for the mistrust, the problems that we have. I think it's a mistake. We're always looking for someone to blame. What the platforms did is opened up the human personality for all to see. Normally, we only had one brat in town, or we only had one of those people that went around and harassed you and was always teasing you and was always trolling you. You know, there were 2 or 3, you could keep away from them. On the internet, you can't. So we're really looking at human personality seen in a major different scaling factor. And it's not the platforms have shown it to us. We used to be able to fool ourselves and think, no, there aren't people like that. Maybe there's 1 or 2, but there aren't people like that. Now we realize that, no, it's a large class. It's part of the human personality. It's part of, and the dynamics of the internet and the cooperation beyond it brings that to the front, forces us to recognize it. And now we have to figure out what to do with it. How do we live with, we've seen over 2,000, 5,000 years, it's hard to change. So how do we live with human behavior at global scale? And that's a problem that I don't see us working on yet.
Humans, can't live with them, can't live without them. All right, thanks. Vittorio, so again, the real thing I'm trying to get at is here, the core elements of the definition that we adopted, can they be useful in thinking about data governance, AI governance, where there's a lot of the same discussion going on? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, in the end, the problems are similar, and the technologies are all based on the use of the internet anyway. And also the actors are basically the same actors that are now ruling the internet. Now they are becoming the rulers of these new technologies. And so I think and the things are integrated. So you cannot govern the internet without governing the AI and vice versa. And so I think, yes, I mean, they're still in the same realm. I think that the discussion on how many stakeholders are to be included is sort of moot, because in the end, no one can prevent civil society or the technical community from existing and doing their things. And the point is, how can we ensure that their views are taken into account? And the reason we gave 20 years ago was that, I mean, in the end, they will still be part of the implementation of these things. So if you build something that doesn't work for the users in the end, then it will not work. But unfortunately, we discovered that I mean the companies that have a dominant position on the market can actually force the users to do whatever they want them to do. And so this, I think, is the where we need to to change something. And I mean, I agree that we should be more focused on the problem of human psychology. So I mean, the human personality. I don't think the platforms are totally innocent because they did build explicitly algorithms, systems that promote the worst parts of human personality and make people more selfish and more self-focused, more angry, more aggressive than they would be without the algorithm, because this is what brings more money to the people that run the platform. But apart from these considerations, I think that the governance problem is still how can we, in a way, be more prescriptive towards the private sector without stifling the technologies and without also giving too much power to governments that are less and less responsive to people. And so in the end, I agree that it's a problem of human personality, but it's also a problem of globalized democracy that we were never able to discuss. And so what's the global democratic governance in general for a globalized unified planet? We don't know. We're still very far from there.
Great, thanks. There's already some interesting comments being made in the chat, so hopefully I want to open it up to the floor in just like 7 or 8 minutes. If hopefully some of those folks who are chatting will want to speak up as well. Let's just do a quick one lastly on what all this means for the IGF, because again, as I noted, and we did a session about this in the webinar series earlier this year or last year, I can't even remember now. We had a proposal from the UN Secretary General's office that we should create a new international organization, a digital cooperation forum that would have a broader focus than the IGF, that could be the place to do all digital stuff. There was a lot of pushback against that. But still we have a continuing discussion today about, do we need new bespoke organizations and agreements, frameworks involving intergovernmental authority for issues like data, AI, other digital cooperation issues, or can it all be done within the IGF? And what does this mean for the IGF? If people could just give a quick sort of thought about how this all relates then to the IGF, whose mandate should be renewed this year, hopefully, at the end of the WSIS review, that would be really useful. Wolfgang.
Any new institution would face the same problems we have discussed the last 20 years. So that means this would lead to duplication, to waste of resources. The same people would have to travel to all these meetings. So this makes absolutely no sense here. But the IGF has to evolve. It has to be aware that the world has changed since the last 20 years. But if you look back to the mandate of the, I think it's paragraph 72 of the Tunis agenda, then if you read it with today, then you think, oh, it's rather flexible. So that means the mandate is good. So that means it's not a question of writing a new mandate, taking into account new developments. It's just, implementing it in a creative way. And so you have all the flexibility. And the beauty of the IGF is you can create your own sub-bodies like dynamic coalition or policy networks and so on, according to the needs. So insofar, I think it would be a big mistake if Amardeep and others in the United Nations would go for let's say a new kingdom for AI and saying, this is AI and this is internet governance, and nobody knows what will be the outcome from the UNCSTD working group on data governance. They had just the first meeting in May. The second meeting will be in July. And so there'll be another body for data governance. I think this is nonsense. Try to use the flexibility of the framework we have with the IGF, but pool it. And I think there are proposals on the table to have the annual AI dialogue linked to the IGF or to UNESCO or to another organization, and not to create new ones. So this is nonsense. Thank you.
Thanks. Marcus. I have to unmute again. Everybody keeps muting and not getting off.
I did unmute, but it came back, the mute. I started saying one of the basic flaws of the GDC is that it creates an artificial dichotomy between digital cooperation and internet governance. It treats internet governance as a subset of digital cooperation. And as I think various panelists here said that it's essentially the same thing. And so obviously, IGF has dealt with all these issues in the past. It's dealing with artificial intelligence right now. But okay, if you do need more impact with the IGF, you can still, and as Wolfgang already said, the mandate is flexible enough to keep changing it. And there has been discussions. Okay, enhance the IGF, give it more power, have a so-called IGF plus, bring more governments in, and the IGF has also been evolving over the years. And it's not just in terms of substance, but also in terms of process and procedure. And the IGF has a very strong intercessional work. There are also the national and regional initiatives, which are present in 140 countries, which can also spread essentially what the IGF has been promoting is participatory democracy on these issues. And I think that remains a value to defend and to keep pushing also for the other issues. These are my 2 cents.
Thanks. It's more than 2 cents. Aubrey.
Yeah. I fall somewhere in between on this one. I agree the IGF has to change, has to open itself up, although there's really a good ability to change in the IGF. It is flexible, it is versatile, perhaps a little too slow at times, but it really is versatile. I think if GDC goes to build something new, they'll spend 10 years dithering about with creating new mechanisms. Do we want one of these? Do we want one of those? You know, maybe we want to use what the IGF did. Can we work there? How do we work together? I think the IGF has to change to support the innovative things and the ways of looking at things differently. But perhaps it's sufficient to make those changes and to change its name. We don't really need a new organization. If the name of this one makes it feel too constrained for people, you know, I don't know that it's necessarily necessary to change the name, but why not? I mean, it's just a name. You know, call it the Data Cooperation Governance Forum. It really doesn't matter what name it is. Is it participatory democracy, as Marcus was referring to? Can it take on new things? Can it look at things differently? Can it still bring in more people? Can it reach out to people? Is it missing the point? How do we fix it if it's missing the point? But the work that goes into creating what IGF now has would just be wasted effort if one were to create a new organization and such. So I'm really for IGF's got to change its name too while you're at it, but keep the IGF. Thanks.
Thanks. Finally, Vittorio.
Yeah, I think I agree with Avri. I mean, there's really no reason to create something which would be more or less the same thing, but under a different name, and then would duplicate the effort. So let's change the name if it's a problem of naming. Otherwise, we can just continue with what we have. So, I mean, if there are people that are proposing a different thing, then we have to understand what's the problem and what would be different from the current IGF. Even if I do see shortcomings in the current IGF, I mean, there's a lot of talk and no action. Then, on the other hand, if you wanted to have more action, I also still don't understand how. So, in the end, I mean, if do we think we need a discussion on how to allow the IGF to take decisions? I don't know. I'm not too convinced, honestly. I don't think that the IGF will be ever able to, for someone, especially under a scenario in which, I mean, that the new call for governance and for regulation is done at the national level. So there are states that want to do national or regional regulation. They don't want to do global treaties. I mean, this is so I don't know if there's any real demand for anything that goes beyond the talk shop, quote unquote, that the IGF has become. But I still think it's useful. So we should fight to keep it.
All right, great. Thanks, Vittorio. All right, so let's open up. I mean, I've seen in the chat comments from Ken and Paul, who's got his advisor in his lap now, and Guy, Yanis, Siva. So it'd be great to hear from anybody who wants to just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and join the conversation. And we have, 25 minutes where we can have a broader discussion. While people are cogitating, I could maybe look at some of the comments that are, okay, good. Let's start with Manal then. Manal, good to see you.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone. Apologies for not being able to switch on my camera. I didn't expect myself to speak. So,
Could you introduce yourself, Manal, for people who don't know you?
yeah, sorry. Manal, I work with the National Telecom Regulatory Authority of Egypt. Thank you. I have comments on three things. First, the WIGIT definition, the IGF, and the multi-stakeholder approaches. So regarding the definition, I think it's broad enough to stand the test of time, though it's a double-edged sword, as one may say, as it depends on the interpretation. So those who are in favor of the definition will always use it to accommodate more, and those who are against will interpret it as such. A question would be, if we need a new one, should it be narrower or more broad? And if you think about this question, I think one would stick to the current definition. On the IGF, like Avri, I don't have a strong position regarding the name. It won't harm to change it, but changing the name is not enough. As already mentioned by others, the mandate already is broad enough or flexible enough to be interpreted as such. But the IGF needs more stability, more sustainability, more structuring of its work, clear, well-established channels with the NRIs, with the leadership panel, with peer UN organizations, and with the entire ecosystem to make sure the outcomes are properly channeled. And finally, on the multi-stakeholder model, again, I fully agree with, I believe it was Wolfgang, that it's not a model or the model, but it's an approach. I personally think it's a common sense approach. When someone is approaching an issue, normally people would think of all aspects. And when I was working back in the 90s at the ministry, we used to invite operators, vendors, and we had working groups, multi-stakeholder working groups, before even the term was coined. I think it depends on the issue and the phase of the process, but the key thing is that this should be an ongoing or more of a lifestyle. We should be really sincere about it and not just inviting stakeholders to tick it off our list. So that even when we are in need for an urgent decision, it then comes out normally well informed if we are already having those channels. So basically, open channels, direct or indirect, so that any voice can find some appropriate channel that ultimately reaches the decision maker. Thank you. I leave it at this.
Great, thanks, Manal. It's very interesting. Let me take another one, then we'll circle back to people just to try to get some voices at the table. Siva, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. I think.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Siva Subramanian. I'm from India, and I think the present ecosystem can be preserved, and multiplicity of organizations would only complicate internet governance. It's the problems are not just simple problems of having to attend more meetings, but much more complicated than that. And so if the IGF already has a flexible mandate it has already started paying attention to new technologies like AI. There has been debates in IGF in the last IGF, and there could be increasing attention to emerging technologies and whatever technologies that need greater attention. So that could all be part of IGF, and only uh, improvement that we could suggest is that IGF evolves further from debates only forum, from being a debates only forum to a forum that would every year and even in regional and national IGFs draw up a rough consensus action items that would at least be attended to by a team or a work group every time. And so these are some of the directions that we could think of, and whatever I'm suggesting is not the perfect solution, but along these lines we could think and modify, amend, and evolve along these ideas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Siva. Interesting points. Why don't we do a quick spin around the table to respond to those first two sets of comments, and then we'll go to the next folks. I see people waiting. Ken, good to see you. Wolfgang, anything in response to Manal and Siva's points? Turn on your mic again.
The complexity will not go away. That means we are moving in a very complex world, both regarding to the substance and the players and the procedures. But to go back, that we say, okay, it's so complex, now we need a single decision maker would be the wrong U-turn. So that means to recreate emperors or tsars or kings to simplify decision making, and to give everything in the hand of just, one group, one person. So that means we have to live, we have to face this complexity, and to take, different views into consideration before moving forward. So that's certainly time consuming, this is frustrating, but I do not see an alternative. The alternative would produce worse results.
Great. Thanks. Marcus?
Yeah, thanks. I like Manal's point that actually inviting non-governmental stakeholders is common sense. And there, I think the IGF did a great job at promoting that through the national and regional IGFs worldwide. And I do recall once I attended a regional IGF in West Africa, where the internet guys said to me, it's the first time actually the minister talks to us, because the minister came because it was sort of under UN flag. And then the minister thought it must be important to go to that meeting. But before, the minister did not talk to the technical guys who actually were running the internet in the country. So I think that in itself is a great achievement. If you spread the idea of participatory democracy, where governments use the common sense, as Manal said, to actually talk to the people who actually are running the show. So that I think is already a big achievement. And otherwise, point Sivas has made, yes, that could be a way. And I think we had, when I worked for ISOC, actually produced a paper where we suggested that in a way, the IGF should be the policy equivalent to the IETF by producing policy recommendation based on rough consensus, but we are not there yet. But that's all part of the improvements, and I think I noticed there's a broad sense here in this meeting that the IGF needs to be improved. So, there is work to be done.
Great, thanks. Well, Avery.
Hi, thanks. I think one of the important points that came up, and it was something I heard in what Manal was saying, is looking at the multi-stakeholder models first of all, the models, and looking at them in terms of various phases and looking at how they apply. For 20 years now, we've sort of been speaking of this undifferentiated model. It's only within the last couple of years. It's only with the Sao Paulo guidelines. It's only with some of the, which were a set of how do you do multi-stakeholder and how can multilateral and multi-stakeholder work together, just to qualify that one, is to look at the variety of models we've got, dig down into them and understand what the mechanisms are, what the dynamics are in those models. How do they work? How do they map to various phases of work that's being done? So I think that is, it's not only understanding governance better, it's not only understanding the data AI environment we're in better, but it's also getting a better understanding, which, as I say, Sao Paulo meetings have gone far, have taken a big step on, is understanding how the multi-stakeholder models can work, the various, the varieties of that model, et cetera. In terms of SIVA, I think at essence, one of the most important things you bring up is how do we turn this massive amount of output we are able to produce into a certain number of outcomes that are useful and can persist. And I think that transition from output to outcome, taking out the prejudice of making decisions, do we vote, who decides, who's this, but just how do you transform outputs into outcomes is an issue that I find fascinatingly important. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some people would argue the process is an outcome in itself, but that's a discussion. Vittorio.
Yeah, much has been said. I mean, maybe the question on, how do we make the IGF create some policy recommendations? I think it's fair. It's been there for 20 years because it was already, since the beginning, under discussion. I mean, we should get consensus. And I guess the initial idea, at least for the most, let's say, internet-oriented parts of the WIGIC and of the original people, was that maybe something like the IETF working groups would start, and so we could adopt the same rough consensus method. And maybe 20 years later, first of all, the IETF is one of the less multi-stakeholder organizations that we have. It's basically mostly engineers, and also the engineers, not all the geographies and types of companies are equally represented. And then there's like 5 human rights activists, all from like the American liberal, whatever. So and still the IETF has problems often in coming to this kind of calling for this like rough consensus. If you actually put together a much more diverse set of stakeholders, calling for consensus is, can you really imagine an architecture that can work? ICANN had to build this overly complex architecture, and again, ICANN is a more narrow problem and with less stakeholders in the end, and less controversial problems in a way. And it takes like 5 years or 10 years to get to a policy conclusion. So I don't know, is it really doable that we put some people together? But maybe we could experiment. So maybe the IGF could just spin off like groups of the willing that will try to tackle a problem and come up with recommendations. And if they are good, they will be at least considered by people that have the power to implement them. That would be an interesting experiment to try, I guess.
Great, thanks. All right, let's go to Ken Cukier. I haven't seen you in many years. Great to see you again. Let's start with you. Go ahead.
Yeah, likewise. And this has been fascinating. And it's great to see first so many people from the past. I see David Allen among others. And so that's a great delight. And so Bill, and brilliant for everyone, and great questions. I thought Manal's point was interesting, and the comment that Bill put into the chat that sort of got a little bit of traction, this idea of there was multi-stakeholderism prior to internet governance, which is a no-brainer. However, what's interesting, let's stop and remind ourselves. I was thinking to myself, yeah, that's right. That's kind of obvious. Why did we feel the need to constantly talk about multi-stakeholderism? Why did that term emerge? And of course, what does it actually mean? In some ways, it's a virtue. Maybe there's virtue signaling. It was a process as you say, the process can be part of the outcome as well. Part of the process itself was the outcome was the process. Marcus used to say that all the time. As a good diplomat would, right? Talking has its own benefit, right? As well as a structure. It became a structure when it came to ICANN and other things. So I was thinking to myself, why would we have used that? Why would that have term been put forward? What was behind it? And I have a provocation as an answer, which was we needed a term by which we could pull out some of the status of the technologists who felt that they were the ones to be responsible for internet governance, which itself was a shorthand for internet self-governance at a time when John Postel ran the names and numbers, and they had created this ganglia of multi-lettered agencies from the IANA to the IETF to the to others that I've now forgotten as well, eventually ICANN, that were actually going to be running things. And in fact, even in terms of societal issues, and ISOC being another, Vint Cerf around 1999 came up with the idea of an IESF, an Internet, Internet Engineering, no, ISTF, Internet Societal Task Force, which would do the policy making that Bill has just mentioned, that would be sort of developing ideas and then passing it on to governments to consider. So it's just, it's I think, a very interesting reminder that this, as Manal points out, there were, as early as, well, she didn't point this out, but as early as the JFK administration, there was these PTACs, these presidential commissions that brought together telecom companies and the military and academia to talk about issues of like hardening America's information infrastructure, et cetera. So multi-stakeholderism had been around for a very long time, but I suspect that we needed a term by which we could put it forward to give a formal mechanism to bring other people to the table and to tell the techies like Postel and others, no, you have to have civil society, you have to have business at the table, you have to, which meant at the time telecom operators to Amazon, to GM, and you have to have, government as well.
Thanks, Ken. Obviously, back in the day, it was also dealing with the fact that governments were trying to assert authority, and so he had to put forward another model. But all right.
Without a doubt, yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Good
So,
point. Yep.
okay, well, we take one more and then we'll go back to the group. So, and also I wanted to try and pick up, guys asked a couple of questions in the chat, so maybe I'll put those out there too. David, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. And for goodness sake, thanks for taking us back in time well over 20 years now. Extraordinary to look across the names here. Many of whom should be speaking here well before me, and I waited, but there it is. As we know, in those discussions in Geneva and Tunis and so forth, there were another set of voices on this question of multi-stakeholderism. Needless to say, I was amongst them. Vittorio has used the phrase globalized democracy, and then in a later intervention, he began to get into the problems of how do you get a globalized democracy. Ken has just used the phrase as input to the government. I don't have an answer. What I want to do is pose the challenges that we discussed back then and are upon us now, as you have brought out in today's. It truly, Avi has taken us to the root of this, the human beings. It's really how human beings get things done. How do we bring inputs from phrases, civil society, but more than how do we bring inputs into the decision process? And it's not a problem that the human race has solved yet. We do it, frankly, often very badly, even at the national level, although occasionally we do it reasonably well there. There are some things that are stand out. But then when we move beyond the nation state to regions, to global, to Vittorio's globalized democracy, we haven't figured out how to get those inputs into a democratic process. For me, the place for us to put our mental firepower here is to ask this question. So how do we, in fact, put these processes together so that it comes out to what all of us would consider to be democratic? And Bill, thank you once again for making this happen. Wow.
Sure. Thanks, David. And democracy is certainly a key factor. I also want to flag, as I said, there are a number of, before I circle back to people, because we're running towards the back end, I want to flag some of the questions that were in the chat. Guy Berger in South Africa asked an important one I think we should also try and address a little bit. What do panelists think could be the downstream consequences outside the US, good to remember, of the current power-driven changes in the norms about what is appropriate for digital governance? It seems like we're thinking about how these things ramify around the world is also an important point, and often the conversations get skewed a bit by who's the most active in the discussion. So anyway, a couple of just ideas that are on the table. Let's spin back again through the group quickly. Wolfgang, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, David, and thank you, Kenneth. Good to see you again. For me, the multi-stakeholder approach and the discussion we had 20 years ago was always a project for what we called at this time the participatory democracy. And we had the discussion, at least in Germany also and in Europe, what is the relationship between participatory democracy and representative democracy? Will it replace? And the argument was no, the representative democracy is good, but the participatory elements will enhance it, will make it better, because the traditional representative democracy has reached to a certain degree its limits, and it needs a certain enhancement. For me, the multi-stakeholder approach is what we have in a what we call in a democracy the checks and balances, so that you have in a group which makes decision, you have also some limits and some people who say no, who bring a different perspective. I think this is important, and this is probably also the way forward why we should try not to agree on everything. And so far, the rough consensus principle, which was mentioned also here, is good because it allows a disagreement. A disagreement will stimulate rethinking and will improve the final outcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Marcus.
Yeah, great. Likewise, great to see you, Kenneth and David. It's been a while. All interesting comments and concepts. Just a few thoughts on global democracy. The UN is the best what we have, but the UN is obviously based on national sovereignty and the nation state. And here, I think, with WIGIG and also through the IGF, we changed a little bit the paradigm, and we spread the idea, the notion of participatory democracy. And yes, of course, most Western democracies have this kind of multi-stakeholder approach. They have to consult business, civil society also, or farmers or whatever. And most Western democracy have fairly well-developed structures where this can happen. I come from a country where we actually go a step further and have direct democracy, where people are actually allowed to vote and vote down the parliaments, the representative democracy. But that's another story. But in any case, I think the spread of participatory democracy is really a great achievement the IGF has had through the national and regional IGFs. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Marcus. Aubrey.
Yeah. One of the things and I really want to thank you for this bit of archaeology we're doing. And on this 20th anniversary of this, I think it's an important time to do that. I mean, here we are at this nexus point where we want all these great new things because somehow the things we have aren't adequate for us anymore. And yet when you read through the report, I started wondering, I almost wanted an annotated report in front of me. I wanted to be able to read the report and having seen and have a almost a URL into some scholar who had actually then gone through and said, how's that changed in the 20 years? What has been implemented of that in the 20 years? How did it work during that? And there's basically, I think that that document is not a stale document. And it's one of the things I was worried about when I started rereading it, is that it'll be stale. It's 20 years old. Come on. You know, we've moved on. We haven't moved on very much at all. Some areas perhaps, but we haven't. And I'd really, not something that I'll end up doing, but I'd really like to see someone take a scholarly approach and actually build that annotated notion that sort of looks at what was said, what occurred, what didn't occur, what was the outcome. So thank you. Looking at this bit of anthropology was wonderful. Archaeology, anthropology, whatever.
Intellectual archaeology is definitely one of my favorite pastimes. So that's why we're here. Vittorio.
Thank you for I mean, basically bearing with my rants and rambling thoughts. And I mean, I just wanted to mention that the point on with the dire geopolitical times we live in, because I think it's important because it's going to change the scenario. In a way, it is what allows now governments like the European ones that have always been faithful to the original laissez-faire model to actually start action. And I mean, go against the American companies. And in the beginning, it was like maybe we're afraid we don't really do it, and now they really want to do it as a reaction to what the U.S. administration has been doing to them. So, but the problem is that the intent risks to get caught in this kind of tariff discussion or war and whatever. And also, there's the military aspect. I mean, we never discussed how to govern the military aspect, both in terms of AI, use of the internet, and now it's becoming more relevant than ever. And but finally, I wanted to say that I still think that the definition is relevant. I think there's an incidental sentence we have to work upon, which is in the respective roles part. We never really got into what are the respective roles, what are the principles that each of the stakeholders should do. I mean, not all of them have the same roles, and they all have to do the same things. And maybe if we could start a new WIGIG or a new group of research group and start discussing that would be a way to advance towards making the IGF more effective and maybe helping it to, I mean, find a way to come to rough consensus on something. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think there's an argument for a new WIGIG, but that's just me. Well, I personally, I mean, I didn't get into trying to push my own views too much on this, but having been involved in the drafting process 20 years ago, I would certainly redo the definition in the contemporary context. I think there's certainly aspects that are very problematic about it, especially the respective roles. But I mean, especially if you wanted to try to make it applicable to data and AI, the second half of it, evolution and use was just too that needs much more specification. But anyway, be that as it may, I think it was an interesting discussion. I want to thank you all for engaging and indulging in my taste for intellectual archaeology. As always, I want to thank Jason Buckwheats, the executive director of CITI, for managing this process and making it happen. Well, this is the last meeting of the semester, and so maybe we see you again in the autumn. Thanks again to the speakers and to all participants, and enjoy the rest of your day, evening, or whatever it is, wherever you are. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Great. Well done.